Okay, so we're heading deep into the weeds in this episode, as this is video number 2 in the little Stornello series and the first of the objective videos. And as I mentioned before, I will be completely honest. If, however, I do drift off and you see me sniffing the exhaust or making calf eyes at the bike, I can only apologise in advance. Before we carry on though, for viewers of a nervous disposition, I must issue a trigger warning. So this video will feature graphic footage of men's underpants, luckily though with nobody wearing them. So without further ado, let's move on to the rest of the video. Okay, so the owning experience. Now, I've only owned the bike for 5 months now and done around 1,500 miles, so obviously I don't have any real longevity of ownership. But, you know, that is more than the bike's annual average mileage over the last 8 or 9 years. What I can say, though, is that through flicking through the receipts and service history, it's been well maintained, and aside from the usual service parts, there's nothing to indicate any issues with the bike in the past. Anyway, let's have a look at the bike in more detail and take a closer look. So first of all, the paintwork on the tank and the frame is great. There's no chips, no flakes, and it looks thick and glossy. On the black painted metal parts, the only corrosion that I can see is on the fork brace and just a little bit on the forks. But that's okay, as the previous owner, Ian, fabulous Ian, is going to send me a replacement part. Thanks, Ian. There's no flaking on the shaft drive or the swing arm, while all nuts and bolts look pretty good also, although there is a patina of discoloration on some of them, for example on the sump bolt, as you can see here. This good condition is obviously down to the love, care and attention from the previous owners, but it has to be said that Guzzis from this era and going forwards, while they are undoubtedly rather basic in some respects, do tend to have a good strong finish on all of the major parts, you know, and even the electrics are mostly sorted. There is nothing blingy though, and some aspects of the bike could probably be described as being rather workmanlike, like take a look at the rear brake lever. Now, you know what, I reckon I could have knocked this up as an apprentice, so if you like your carved from billet aluminium look, you might not necessarily like the Guzzis of this era. Likewise, the chrome plastic indicators, but you know, hey ho. But then again, you do have alloy mudguards on which a variety of tunes can be played. The engine is sweet, and like all air-cooled Guzzis, it thrums with the clutch in and rattles like a tin of drawing pins when it's out. Let's have a listen to this. More importantly though, there's no smoke and no visible oil leaks, and neither does the bike seem to be using any oil. From a basic maintenance perspective, the main consideration is the oil, and outside of the fork oil you've got 3 areas and types of oil to keep an eye on. So first of all, there's the shaft drive, then there's the gearbox, and then the engine oil. And all of these take different types of oil. And one of the complaints about the engine oil is the meagre engine oil capacity at under 2 litres. And there is some confusion as to how much oil is needed for the various models, and also issues if overfilled. For example, you get oil blowback into the air filter or seals being blown. The recommendation is to make sure the engine oil level comes halfway between minimum and maximum on the dipstick. So basically on this bike you've got oil drain bolts absolutely all over the place, and some of them are not always easy to get at. The other thing to consider is parts availability, especially when Piaggio, the owners of Moto Guzzi, don't necessarily have the best reputation in the world. Stuff like the metal bodywork and especially the Arrow exhaust are going to be a little bit hard to come by, but everything else is the same as the standard Mark II stones, so either new or second-hand bits shouldn't be too hard to come by. For me, as a basic fettler of bikes only, you know, so oils, filters, brakes, this bike is a nice balance between owning a proper old classic, and I'd love a BSA 810, and a complicated new bike that I'm too scared to touch. Yes, it needs a little bit more maintenance, you know, than a newer bike or a non-Guzzi, but everything is mostly easy to get at, and there's a thriving community of folk and forums who are happy to share their wisdom and experience. Which reminds me, the Stornello does have, along with pretty much every V7 that I've ever owned, probably one of the worst side stands in the world. Look how far it leans over. Anyway, some of you may have noticed that in the ride by there was something fluttering at the back of my bike. Yes, look at this. It's a pair of pants. So what I was trying to do is, and a suggestion from one of the many viewers of the channel who suggested that in my comment about the engine bars, which I didn't quite like, that actually the engine bars might be really good for drying my laundry on, so I thought I'd give it a go. Now unfortunately the British standard close peg is a bit too small to fit on the engine bars. However, the Hepco and Becker rack, Hepco and Becker rack is really good for doing your laundry on. So I've got my smalls here, nice pair of boxers, and then on the other side got the socks. There you go. Now I only appear to have one, so I might have to go and find the other. But what can I say? These were wringing wet when I came out, gone for a short ride on the Guzzi, bone dry, and they smell of the countryside. And a bit of hydrocarbons and burnt petrol. But you know, apart from that, you can't go and grumble. Okay, the riding experience. Well, the first thing to say is that this bike, like all of the V7 range, feels much older than it really is. The V7 Mark II came out in 2014, which I guess is pretty much the modern era, you know, what with most bikes by then having IMUs, traction control, smooth, powerful engines like clutches, etc. The thing to consider though is that the Moto Guzzi V7 range are not modern retros. They are essentially old bikes which have been modernised, and the riding experience very much reflects that. This particular bike, for instance, feels less refined than my old 1988 Honda Dominator, and while it feels like something from the early 1980s, it's still perfectly usable and safe to use on modern roads with modern traffic, as it has enough engine poke and handling to hold its own, even if there are some aspects of the riding experience which could be charitably described as basic and adequate at best, which we'll come on to shortly. Before that though, it's worth noting that this is a bike which expects you to adapt to it in order to get the best out of it. For example, the clutch and gearbox. I mean, it's not a slipper clutch for a start, and you can't just bang it down the box like a modern bike. You've got to match the revs to the gears accordingly, and be aware of the shaft drive reaction if the gear change isn't in the sweet spot. Get it wrong and it all feels a bit awkward and a bit lurchy, with the shaft drive feeling as though it's going to jump out of its casing and whack you around the head. So feeding the clutch in, feeling the gears in is the way to go. And while it's not hard to do and quickly becomes second nature, if you prefer the feel of a modern bike, then it might really annoy you. Likewise with the fuel injection, and here we'll go to outside broadcast for more details. You can definitely tell that the fuel injection is like version 1 Mark 1 of the fuel injection map, and once you're going it's absolutely fine, but starting off from cold and at low revs in first, second gear, it is a little bit fluffy, and it does feel as though the engine is going to die sometimes. It never actually does, it just kind of coughs and then gathers itself. Once it's warmed up, it's absolutely spot on, and once the engine is spinning, you know, like anything above 2000 revs, the fuel injection is absolutely brilliant. But I know some folk, quite rightly, are a little bit finicky about fuel injection and fueling. This one is imperfect at low revs, and you definitely feel it in the lower gears. You easily, you know, you can easily over time just ride around it, you know, as I've done and as probably other owners have done, but it's probably just worth mentioning. Now you can get other maps, and I've also been told that you can just pull out the O2 sensor and things improve. I don't know, I might give that a go, but for me, not really a problem. But worth mentioning, it is definitely version 1.0 of fuel injection. The handling is really good though. It's neutral, stable, easy to turn, but needs input. The suspension is pretty basic though and crashy, so you'll find yourself looking through bends to see if there are any bumps ahead. And also, as you get to know the engine characteristics, using the engine to help smooth the suspension out, or at least get it working as best it can. The riding experience is dominated by the engine though. At only 48 horsepower, you think it would be wheezing away, and while it doesn't feel like there's much point in revving beyond 6,500 RPM, the pull from 4,000 revs in all gears is cracking. So let's go over to the outside broadcast again. I was trying to hide in that hedge, but I'll tell you what, it's a bit prickly. Okay, so the engine on the V7 Mark II Stornello, it only makes 48 horsepower, and that sounds absolutely rubbish, doesn't it? But I'll tell you what, those 48 horses are absolutely high quality. I mean, they feel more like dray horses than, you know, something that you'd see at the Grand National. And it definitely punches above its weight, you know, to use that particular cliche. I mean, the mid-range, which on this bike is around 4,000 revs up to about 6,000 revs, I'll tell you what, it really pulls. I mean, I'd like to use another cliche, you know, that it pulls like a little train. It probably pulls more like either the engine, but I'll tell you what, once it's going, it feels as though nothing will stop it, you know, and it feels as though there's lots of weight in the engine itself. And I don't know whether that's because of the heron-headed pistons, whether they are actually heavier than normal pistons, but it's kind of got that heavy, classic feeling, flywheel, lots of weight to the reciprocating parts, which is in quite stark difference to the V7 Mark III. You know, so as a result, it's really satisfying to use the engine, you know, and you can open it up pretty much in any gear from just under 4,000 revs and it'll pull. Now, this is the V7 Mark II, so it's got 6 gears, and I'll tell you what, the 6th gear is like the world's biggest overdrive, yet it will still pull it, it will still lug it. And I know this is always an excuse to use the Coburn and Hughes adverts, but this little engine really is extremely long-legged. I mean, at 4,000 revs, in top gear, it's doing something like 75 miles an hour. I mean, it's incredible, and it will still pull it without juddering. And there's something so delightful and at the same time so usable in the way that the engine delivers its power. So I think, you know, from that aspect of the riding experience, you can keep up with everything. It'll accelerate good enough. It'll cruise at 80 miles an hour really easy. And it's a really beautiful, soulful engine to use from day to day. In summary then, you've got a very analog feeling bike in a very digital world, and sure, it needs a little bit more maintenance perhaps than a modern bike, but you know, it's perfectly usable and safe to use on today's modern roads. It'll keep up with traffic, it'll cruise easily at 80 miles an hour. Obviously it's got the shaft drive and a big tank, so it's very practical, to be honest, and perfectly safe. I mean, you could even use it for all round, you know, all year round commuting, but I guess my question to you would be, well, why on earth would you? And I would imagine that, you know, after a hard day's work, you know, 12 hours down the pit or writing poetry or whatever, and it's absolutely throwing it down, I think then the idiosyncrasies of the Moto Guzzi might just annoy you a little bit, and you'd probably be better off doing that kind of commuting on an ADV 350 scooter. So the bike isn't a sanitised digital experience, rather it's an admittedly imperfect one that is, however, gently visceral in its execution and riding experience. It provides a real sense of riding a much older bike, and while it might need a little more maintenance, it's still perfectly usable, doesn't need to be cosseted, and is just a delight to ride. So to slip into the subjective for a second, it's also coolest. Look at this, I've dried my pants. Now what I'd recommend though is you do double peg your pants. That sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? But yeah, I do recommend you double peg them, because of course you wouldn't want them flying off and getting caught in the back wheel or anything like that. And also on the Hepco and Becker rack, I've also done the wife's socks. Now, there was